Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his face against the wet coral, artillery shells screaming overhead, and watched something impossible unfold on the beach below. Another wave of American landing craft, the 8th that morning, ground onto the sand, ramps dropping before the boats even fully stopped. 36 Marines poured from each craft in seconds. The boats reversed off the beach, swung around, and headed back toward the distant ships to fetch another load. He'd been on Tarawa, then the Marshalls, now the Marianas. And at every island, more of these strange, blunt-nosed boats. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. Where did they all come from? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Imperial Navy had told him the Americans couldn't sustain this, that their industrial capacity was exaggerated propaganda, that after 2 or 3 amphibious assaults they'd run out of landing craft, out of ships, out of will. But here, on Saipan in June of 1944, he counted 157 landing craft visible from his position alone, and the artillery spotter above him on the ridge had radioed that he could see at least 300 more. How was one nation building this many boats? Takeshi Yamamoto had graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy's Coastal Defense course in 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. The instructors had been clear. Japan's greatest advantage was its defensive perimeter. The vast Pacific Ocean itself would serve as a moat. American forces, they taught, would find amphibious warfare nearly impossible to sustain. Landing troops on a hostile shore required specialized vessels that were expensive, complex, and time-consuming to build. The United States Navy, despite its size, had fewer than 200 proper landing craft at the start of the war. To assault even one fortified island required dozens of these vessels, and the Japanese defenders would destroy many in each battle. Simple mathematics, his instructors insisted, meant the Americans could manage perhaps 5 or 6 major amphibious operations before they'd exhausted their landing craft fleet. After that, Japan's island garrisons would stand unmolested, and the American advance would grind to a halt. The strategy made perfect sense. Yamamoto had studied the detailed reports of the Gallipoli campaign in World War I, where British and Anzac forces suffered catastrophic casualties trying to land on Turkish beaches. The Ottoman defenders, well entrenched and prepared, had turned the shoreline into a killing ground. The Allies had landed from regular ships' boats, slow, unarmoured, designed for peaceful harbour work. Men had to climb down rope nets while under fire, then row toward beaches swept by machine gun fire. Japan's defensive doctrine assumed the Americans would face similar limitations, even if they developed specialized landing craft. These would be sophisticated naval vessels requiring skilled shipyard workers, steel allocations competing with destroyer and carrier production, and months of construction time per unit. The Imperial General Staff calculated that America might produce perhaps 50 to 100 landing craft per year at most, and combat losses would steadily erode even that modest fleet. But standing on Saipan's volcanic rock in the summer of 1944, watching the 9th wave of landing craft approach, Yamamoto understood that something fundamental in these calculations had gone catastrophically wrong. What he couldn't know, what no Japanese defender could have imagined, was that the endless stream of landing craft grinding onto Pacific beaches hadn't come from traditional shipyards at all. They'd come from the vision of a stubborn, profane boat builder from New Orleans who'd spent the 1930s arguing with lumber suppliers in the Louisiana Bayou. Andrew Jackson Higgins was not a military man. He'd never served in uniform, never attended a naval academy, never designed a warship. He was a Nebraska-born businessman who drifted to New Orleans in the 1920s and started building shallow draft boats for oil prospectors working in Louisiana's swamps and marshes. His customers needed vessels that could navigate through water barely a foot deep, carrying heavy loads of drilling equipment, then beach themselves on muddy banks to unload without requiring a dock or pier. The boats Higgins designed looked wrong to anyone trained in traditional shipbuilding. They had flat bottoms instead of proper keels. They had blunt, squared-off bows instead of the sharp, knife-like prows that every naval architect knew were essential for cutting through water efficiently. They were built from plywood. instead of proper marine-grade hardwood or steel. But they worked. Higgins' boats could operate in water so shallow that conventional craft would ground themselves helplessly. They could run right up onto a riverbank, unload their cargo, then back off and return to deeper water. Oil prospectors loved them. Trappers working the bayous ordered them. The rum runners who'd operated during Prohibition had favoured them because they could duck into shallow channels where Coast Guard cutters couldn't follow. By the late 1930s, Higgins Industries was building about 100 boats a year for commercial customers, operating out of a modest facility in New Orleans. Andrew Higgins himself was known locally as a hard-drinking, foul-mouthed taskmaster who worked his employees relentlessly and engaged in legendary shouting matches with suppliers, competitors, and occasionally his own customers. Then the United States Marine Corps came calling. The Marines had been studying amphibious warfare since the mid-1920s, disturbed by the Gallipoli disaster and convinced that future conflicts might require large-scale opposed landings. They'd experimented with various designs, all unsatisfactory. Traditional ships' boats were too slow and vulnerable. Purpose-built landing craft designs from established naval shipyards were promising but expensive each one, essentially a small warship, requiring months to construct. In 1938, a Marine Corps officer named Victor Krulak saw one of Higgins' commercial boats operating in the Louisiana bayous. The flat-bottom design, the shallow draft, the ability to beach and retract these were exactly the characteristics the Marines needed. Krulak arranged for the Marine Corps to test several Higgins boats. The initial tests in 1939 revealed both promise and a critical flaw. The boats performed beautifully in the water and could indeed beach themselves on almost any shoreline. But once beached, the troops inside had to climb over the high sides of the boat, exposing themselves to enemy fire during the most access to stows, vulnerable moment of the landing. Some test soldiers were given life jackets weighted with sandbags to simulate combat loads. They struggled to haul themselves over the gunwales while carrying rifles and heavy packs. The Marine Corps requested a modification. Could Higgins add a ramp to the bow so troops could run straight off the front of the boat onto the beach? Higgins refused. He'd built thousands of boats with the blunt bow design and knew it worked perfectly for his commercial customers who loaded and unloaded from the sides or stern. Adding a ramp to the bow would require completely redesigning the hull structure, changing the weight distribution, and potentially compromising the shallow draft characteristics that made the design valuable in the first place. Besides, Higgins argued, his boats weren't warships. If the military wanted specialized landing craft, they should go to a proper naval shipyard. The Marines went to the Bureau of Ships, the Navy's design authority, which commissioned its own landing craft design. The result was the Bureau boat, which did have a bow ramp. It was also slower, drew more water, and cost significantly more to build than Higgins' design. The Marines tested both, and weren't satisfied with either option. Then, in 1941, everything changed. A Marine Corps officer returning from observing Japanese amphibious operations in China brought back photographs and sketches of a Japanese landing craft called the Daihatsu. The Japanese had solved the bow ramp problem. Their design featured a protected ramp that dropped down from the bow, allowing troops to charge directly onto the beach. When shown the Japanese design, Higgins studied it for less than a week, then built a prototype of his own boat with an integrated bow ramp. The design worked. The ramp was reinforced, operated by a simple winch mechanism, and when lowered formed a perfect gangway from the boat's interior directly onto the beach. Troops could disembark in seconds rather than struggling over the sides. The new design, designated the LCVP landing craft, vehicle, personnel, was 36 feet long and 10 feet wide. It drew only 3 feet of water when fully loaded, meaning it could approach to within yards of almost any beach. The plywood hull construction made it light enough to be mass-produced quickly, yet sturdy enough to withstand beaching on coral, rock, or sand. The boat could carry either 36 combat-loaded troops, or a jeep and 12 men, or 8,000 pounds of cargo. Most revolutionary was the speed at which these boats could be built. Traditional landing craft from established shipyards required specialized steel, skilled welders, and months of construction time. Higgins' design used readily available materials, plywood, common marine engines, basic hardware, and could be assembled in weeks by workers with minimal shipbuilding experience. The boats weren't elegant, but they were functional, repairable, and, above all, producible in extraordinary numbers. When the United States entered World War II in December of 1941, the Navy ordered its first large batch of Higgins boats. Andrew Higgins immediately began transforming his operation from a small commercial boatyard into an industrial powerhouse. He bought up vacant warehouses throughout New Orleans. He hired workers from across the South, many of them women and African Americans who'd been excluded from better-paying industrial jobs. He instituted 3 shifts running 24 hours a day. He designed assembly line techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing, with each boat moving through stations where specialized teams installed engines, fitted out interiors, attached the bow ramp mechanism, and applied waterproofing. The production numbers began modestly. In 1942, Higgins Industries delivered about 1,200 landing craft. The boats proved themselves in the North African landings that November, where thousands of American troops came ashore from Higgins boats at Casablanca and Oran. Marine Corps reports praised the design's reliability and ease of operation. The Navy increased its orders. Higgins expanded again, taking over more facilities, hiring more workers. By 1943, his plants were producing more than 1,500 landing craft per month. The boats participated in the Sicily landings in July of 1943, where over 3,000 Allied vessels, hundreds of them, Higgins boats, delivered troops across Mediterranean beaches. But it was in the Pacific where the Higgins boats' true strategic importance became undeniable. The island-hopping campaign required amphibious assault after amphibious assault. Tarawa, in November of 1943, saw Marines landing from Higgins boats onto a reef-protected atoll, the shallow draft allowing the craft to navigate coral that would have stopped deeper draft vessels. Casualties were heavy. The Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination, but the landing craft performed exactly as designed, delivering wave after wave of reinforcements. Kwajalein, in January of 1944, Eniwetok in February, the Marianas in June and July. Each operation required hundreds of landing craft. Each beach saw multiple waves of Higgins boats grinding onto the sand, ramps dropping, troops charging out, boats retracting to fetch another load. By mid-1944, Higgins Industries employed over 20,000 workers across multiple plants in New Orleans and beyond. The company was producing more than 700 landing craft per month, along with PT boats and other small vessels. Production techniques had been refined to the point where a Higgins boat could be completed in less than 3 weeks from raw materials to delivery. The boats were standardized, interchangeable, repairable with common parts. When damaged in combat, they could often be patched up, on the beach, using materials readily available on any naval vessel. Engines were standard commercial models, available from multiple suppliers. The plywood hull sections could be replaced by minimally trained ship fitters. The boats required no specialized dry dock for maintenance. They could be hauled up onto any beach for repairs. From the American perspective, the Higgins boat was simply good engineering married to industrial capacity. It solved a military problem through practical design and mass production. But from the Japanese defensive positions, watching landing craft swarm toward their beaches in numbers that seemed to multiply with each operation, the boats represented something far more psychologically devastating. Yamamoto had first encountered them at Tarawa in late 1943. He'd been part of the Special Naval Landing Force assigned to defend the atoll, considered elite troops equivalent to Marines. The pre-invasion briefings had assured the defenders that American landing craft would be destroyed in large numbers by the coastal defenses, and that even if some boats reached the beach, American industrial capacity couldn't replace such losses quickly enough to sustain additional operations. The battle had been savage. Japanese guns had indeed destroyed many landing craft. Yamamoto had personally witnessed at least a dozen burning or sinking in the lagoon. American casualties were horrific, the coral reef forcing many Marines to wade hundreds of yards under fire when their boats grounded on the reef at low tide. The defenders fought from prepared bunkers, exacting a terrible price for every yard of beach. But the landing craft kept coming, wave after wave. Dozens became, scores became hundreds. When defenders destroyed one boat, two more appeared to take its place. And, in the aftermath, when Yamamoto was among the handful of survivors evacuated before the island fell, he'd learned that the Americans were already preparing the next assault, showing no sign that the material losses at Tarawa had depleted their capacity for further operations. At Kwajalein 3 months later, he saw even more landing craft. The American preliminary bombardment was heavier, more sustained, demonstrating that they'd learned from Tarawa's costly lessons. But what struck Yamamoto most was the sheer abundance of everything. The landing craft came in such numbers that they seemed to blot out the lagoon. Each wave brought not just troops but supplies, ammunition crates, water cans, medical equipment, rations, all landed directly onto the beach from the boat's bow ramps. Now, at Saipan, the scale had become almost incomprehensible. Yamamoto had counted landing craft until he reached 200 and simply stopped, overwhelmed by the futility of trying to track individual vessels in such a massive fleet. His defensive position on the ridge gave him a clear view of the beach operations, and what he witnessed bore no resemblance to the doctrines he'd been taught. The Americans landed supplies with the same casual abundance he might have expected at a peacetime port facility. Jeeps drove directly off the landing craft onto the sand. Pallets of ammunition were unloaded by work crews who seemed unhurried, almost leisurely, despite occasional Japanese artillery fire. Medical stations were established within hours, complete with tents, cots, and enough bandages and plasma to supply a major hospital. Between waves of landing craft, Yamamoto watched repair crews working on damaged boats right there on the beach. Boats that had taken shrapnel hits were patched with what appeared to be simple plywood sections. Engines that had failed were swapped out in less than an hour. Within a day of the initial landing, the Americans had organized the beach into landing zones, supply dumps, casualty collection points, vehicle parks, all supplied by an endless rotation of those blunt-nosed boats. What Yamamoto couldn't see, but would later learn from American propaganda leaflets dropped over Japanese positions, was the full scale of Higgins boat production. By mid-1944, more than 15,000 had been built. By the war's end, the total would exceed 23,000. Add in similar landing craft from other manufacturers who'd copied or licensed Higgins' basic design, and the total American landing craft fleet numbered over 35,000 vessels. To put that number in perspective, Japan's entire amphibious warfare fleet at the start of the war consisted of fewer than 300 specialized landing craft. The Japanese had built excellent vessels. The Daihatsu that had inspired Higgins' bow ramp modification was a sound design. But Japan's shipyards were focused on destroyers, carriers, submarines, and battleships. Landing craft received low priority for steel allocation and skilled labor. Even if Japan had prioritized landing craft production, its shipbuilding industry couldn't have approached American output. Japanese yards were artisan operations where skilled craftsmen built ships one at a time with painstaking attention to quality. The idea of mass-producing boats using semi-skilled labor, assembly line techniques, and plywood construction would have been rejected as beneath the dignity of proper shipbuilding. This philosophical difference in manufacturing approach extended across every category of war production. American industry had spent the 1920s and 30s perfecting mass production techniques, learning to build acceptable quality products quickly and cheaply, rather than perfect products slowly and expensively. Henry Ford's assembly lines, General Motors' interchangeable parts systems, and the mass production of consumer goods from automobiles to refrigerators had created an industrial culture that valued quantity and standardization. Japan's industrial culture remained rooted in artisan craftsmanship. Quality was paramount. Each item was built to precise specifications by skilled workers. This approach produced excellent results. Japanese optics, for instance, were world-class, and Japanese steel quality was superb. But it meant production remained relatively slow and labor-intensive. When applied to military production, these different philosophies yielded dramatically different results. American yards built Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels that were neither beautiful nor particularly durable but could be completed in weeks. Japan built carefully crafted cargo vessels that took months. America mass-produced the M4 Sherman tank using automobile industry techniques. Nearly 50,000 were built. Japan produced fewer than 6,000 tanks total during the entire war, each one essentially handmade. The Higgins boat embodied everything about American industrial philosophy that Japanese military planners had failed to understand. It wasn't a superior design in terms of elegance or craftsmanship. Japanese engineers, examining a captured Higgins boat after the war, noted the crude welds, the rough plywood finish, the utilitarian simplicity of the engine installation. By Japanese standards of shipbuilding quality, it was barely acceptable. But it worked, and it could be built in vast numbers by workers who'd been farmers or shop clerks 3 months earlier. And when damaged, it could be repaired quickly with common materials. And most critically, the same industrial logic that produced Higgins boats by the thousands applied to every other category of American war production. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Yamamoto's psychological journey from confidence to confusion to horrified understanding followed a pattern shared by countless Japanese defenders across the Pacific. The first encounters with American material abundance seemed like anomalies. Perhaps this particular American unit had gotten lucky with supplies, or perhaps they were making a special effort for this specific operation. But operation after operation, island after island, the pattern held. The Americans always had more landing craft, more supplies, more ammunition, more vehicles, more everything. The abundance never diminished. The supposedly exhausted American industrial capacity never seemed to actually exhaust itself. During quiet moments between bombardments on Saipan, Yamamoto tried to reconcile what he'd been taught with what he'd witnessed. His instructors at the academy weren't fools. The strategic analysis made sense. Amphibious operations were resource-intensive, landing craft were complex vessels, American industrial capacity had limits. But somewhere in that analysis, a fundamental miscalculation had occurred. The Americans hadn't built landing craft the way the Japanese would have as specialized naval vessels requiring major shipyard facilities and skilled naval architects. They'd built them the way they built automobiles on assembly lines, with standardized parts, using semi-skilled workers following simplified procedures. It was the industrial equivalent of a magic trick. While Japan's analysts were watching the traditional shipyards and counting how many specialized naval vessels could be produced per year, America was building boats in warehouses using plywood and techniques borrowed from furniture manufacturing. The psychological impact went beyond mere surprise at American material abundance. It represented a fundamental challenge to the narrative that had sustained Japanese defensive doctrine. Defenders had been told they were buying time, forcing the Americans to exhaust their resources through costly assaults that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Each island was supposed to be so expensive in American blood and material that eventually they'd have to negotiate rather than continue the grinding advance. But if American industrial capacity was this deep, if they could casually produce 23,000 landing craft while simultaneously building hundreds of destroyers, thousands of aircraft, and millions of tons of other equipment, then the defensive strategy wasn't buying time at all. It was simply delaying the inevitable. Yamamoto watched another wave of landing craft approach through the smoke of the afternoon bombardment. 12 boats in this wave, each carrying a full load of Marines. The boats would beach, unload in seconds, retreat, return to the transports, reload, and come back for another run. They'd do this all day, all week if necessary, and there were apparently thousands more boats available if these were somehow all destroyed. He thought about the welder in New Orleans. The American propaganda leaflets had mentioned Andrew Higgins by name, clearly intending to demoralize Japanese defenders by emphasizing American industrial prowess. A civilian boat builder had designed these craft, not a naval architect, not a military engineer, but a businessman making swamp boats for oil workers. That detail somehow made it worse. The Americans hadn't even needed their best designers or their primary shipyards to produce this fleet. They'd done it almost as an afterthought, converting commercial boat-building techniques to military production. What did that say about the depth of their industrial capacity? What did it say about the accuracy of Japanese intelligence estimates? The artillery spotter above Yamamoto's position called down updated counts. The American beachhead now extended nearly a mile inland and half a mile along the coast. Supply dumps were visible even through the smoke and dust. The American flag flew from 3 different positions. And out in the lagoon, another group of landing craft was forming up for the next wave. Yamamoto had survived Tarawa and Kwajalein through a combination of luck and the specific positioning of his defensive bunker. He had no illusions about surviving Saipan. The island would fall, the only question was how long the defenders could hold. Not because of any failure of Japanese courage or tactical skill, but because of simple mathematics. The Americans had more of everything. And unlike the situation his instructors had described, where American resources would gradually deplete, the abundance seemed inexhaustible. For every landing craft destroyed, 10 more appeared. For every vehicle knocked out, 20 more drove off the beach. For every casualty inflicted, 100 more Marines landed. Somewhere in Louisiana, in factories that traditional military planners had probably never even considered, workers who might have been building furniture or fishing boats 18 months ago were now churning out landing craft at a rate that would have been considered impossible by any pre-war strategic assessment. That was the revelation that shattered Japanese defensive doctrine. It wasn't that American soldiers were superior fighters, or that American equipment was dramatically better in quality. It was that America could produce acceptable quality equipment in quantities that made quality almost irrelevant. 10 mediocre boats beat 1 excellent boat. 100 roughly built landing craft beat any defensive position simply through the mathematics of overwhelming material superiority. The evening of the 3rd day of the Saipan invasion, Yamamoto's position received orders to fall back to secondary defensive lines. American forces had pushed too far inland. The coastal positions were about to be cut off. As his unit withdrew through the volcanic terrain, moving only at night to avoid American aircraft, Yamamoto passed through abandoned Japanese command posts where maps and intelligence documents lay scattered. One document caught his attention, a pre-invasion intelligence summary, estimating American landing craft availability. The analysis predicted the Americans would commit approximately 200 landing craft to the Saipan operation, representing a significant portion of their supposedly limited fleet. The summary noted with confidence that such commitment would necessarily reduce American capacity for simultaneous operations elsewhere. Yamamoto had personally counted more than 200 landing craft before he'd stopped counting, and that was just the vessels visible from his single position. The artillery spotter's count suggested at least 400, possibly 500 landing craft were participating in the invasion, and American radio broadcasts, which the Japanese monitored, made clear that simultaneous operations were underway in Europe. The Normandy invasion had occurred just days earlier, involving thousands of additional landing craft. The intelligence estimates weren't just wrong by a small margin, they were wrong by an order of magnitude. And that miscalculation had shaped Japan's entire defensive strategy for the Pacific War. The Higgins boat production story illustrates a broader pattern in World War II industrial competition. Both Axis and Allied nations entered the war with roughly similar understandings of industrial capacity based on peacetime production metrics. Germany produced more steel than Britain. Japan's shipbuilding industry was world-class. Italy had advanced manufacturing sectors, but peacetime production metrics proved almost meaningless predictors of wartime industrial capacity. What mattered wasn't the sophistication of existing facilities, but the speed with which industrial capacity could be expanded and the flexibility with which manufacturing techniques could be adapted to new purposes. The United States, in particular, proved extraordinarily adept at this transformation. The automobile industry converted to tank and aircraft production. Furniture manufacturers built aircraft components. Textile mills produced parachutes and uniforms, and a New Orleans boat builder who'd spent the 1930s arguing with lumber suppliers, became the producer of the war's most numerous specialized military vessel. Andrew Higgins himself remained a controversial figure throughout the war. He paid his workers well by contemporary standards, but drove them mercilessly. He clashed repeatedly with Navy officials over contract terms, quality standards, and production priorities. He was investigated multiple times for possible profiteering, though no charges were ever filed. His habit of appearing at his plants drunk and loudly berating employees became legendary. But he delivered the boats. Month after month, year after year, the landing craft poured out of his New Orleans facilities and from the additional plants he established in other cities. By 1944, Higgins Industries had become one of the largest employers in Louisiana, with plants operating around the clock and workers living in company-built housing near the facilities to minimize commute time. The boats themselves saw service in every theater of the war. In the Pacific, they enabled the island-hopping campaign from Guadalcanal in 1942 through Okinawa in 1945. In Europe, they participated in landings in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, southern France, and most famously at Normandy on June 6, 1944, where thousands of Higgins boats carried American, British, and Canadian troops onto the beaches. The Normandy invasion represented perhaps the most concentrated use of Higgins boats in a single operation. Planning documents for Operation Overlord called for over 1,400 LCVPs in the initial assault waves alone, with hundreds more in reserve and for subsequent supply runs. The boats approached the beaches in carefully organized waves, timed to the minute, each boat knowing its specific landing zone and carrying troops from designated units. German defenders, like their Japanese counterparts in the Pacific, had anticipated an Allied invasion, but had fundamentally miscalculated the scale. German intelligence estimates suggested the Allies might be able to assemble perhaps 300 to 400 landing craft for a cross-channel invasion, enough for a limited assault that could potentially be contained and defeated at the waterline. Instead, the first day of the invasion saw over 7,000 vessels of all types participating, with several thousand of those being Higgins boats and similar landing craft. The sheer number of boats meant that even heavy casualties among the initial waves and casualties at Omaha Beach were indeed horrific, couldn't prevent follow-on waves from continuing to land. Boats that survived their first run simply returned for another load. German commanders reporting to Berlin on the invasion's first day struggled to convey the scale. Written accounts describe officers attempting to count landing craft and giving up, instead using phrases like uncountable numbers or hundreds upon hundreds. The psychological impact mirrored what Japanese defenders experienced in the Pacific, the realization that Allied industrial capacity had been drastically underestimated. The engineering of the Higgins boat, while appearing crude, actually incorporated several subtle design features that contributed to its effectiveness. The flat bottom, which seemed primitive to traditionally trained naval architects, actually distributed weight more evenly and provided better stability during beach landings. The blunt bow, which looked inefficient, created a wave pattern that actually helped clear obstacles from the boat's path as it approached shore. The shallow draft meant the boats could navigate through water barely deeper than a man's height, allowing them to approach much closer to shore than conventional vessels. The bow ramp, operated by a simple cable and pulley system, could be dropped in seconds and was sturdy enough to support vehicles driving directly from the SARS boat onto the beach. Most importantly, the simple construction meant the boats were repairable under field conditions. Unlike complex military equipment requiring specialized parts and trained technicians, a damaged Higgins boat could often be patched by any carpenter or mechanic with basic tools. The plywood hull sections were replaceable. The engines were commercial models, with parts available from multiple suppliers. Even significant damage could be repaired in hours rather than days. This repairability had strategic implications. Landing craft damaged in one operation could be quickly restored and available for the next operation. The Americans didn't need to build enough boats to replace all damaged craft. They only needed to build enough to cover permanent losses and to expand the total fleet for larger operations. Combat damage that would have sidelined a more complex vessel for weeks or months became a temporary inconvenience with Higgins boats. Japanese intelligence, analyzing American amphibious capabilities, had focused on tracking the construction of new landing craft while underestimating how many damaged boats were being returned to service. Reports counted boats sunk or destroyed, but didn't account for boats damaged and repaired. This created a persistent underestimation of the actual size of the American landing craft fleet. By late 1944, even Japanese commanders who'd never personally witnessed an American amphibious assault understood that something had gone catastrophically wrong with their strategic assumptions. Intelligence summaries began acknowledging that American landing craft numbers far exceeded initial estimates, though the reports still struggled to convey the true scale of American industrial output. Yamamoto, surviving the fall of Saipan through another combination of luck and the confusion of the final Japanese defensive collapse, was eventually evacuated to the Philippines. There, in late 1944, he witnessed the Leyte Gulf landings, an operation that dwarfed even Saipan in scale. The American invasion fleet included over 700 vessels, with landing craft numbered in the thousands. By this point, Yamamoto had stopped trying to count individual boats. The specific numbers no longer mattered. What mattered was the fundamental reality they represented. Japan was fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity was so far beyond Japanese estimates that continued resistance was mathematically futile. In his post-war memoir, written in the 1950s after Japan's reconstruction had begun, Yamamoto reflected on the psychological journey from confident defender to resigned witness of inevitable defeat. He noted that the landing craft themselves had become a symbol of American industrial power not because they were particularly sophisticated weapons, but because there were so many of them. "We could destroy 10 of their boats," he wrote, "and 20 more would appear. We could sink 100, and 200 more would land the next day. It wasn't that we lacked courage, or that our weapons were ineffective. It was that we were fighting an enemy who could casually produce in 1 month what our entire nation might build in a year." The Higgins boats' production numbers tell the story with stark clarity. Total production from 1942 through 1945 exceeded 23,000 boats from Higgins Industries alone. Other manufacturers, producing similar designs under license or developing their own variations, added thousands more. The total American landing craft fleet by war's end included over 35,000 specialized vessels for amphibious operations. To put this in comparative context, the entire German Kriegsmarine at the start of World War II included fewer than 1,200 commissioned vessels of all types. The Imperial Japanese Navy, considerably larger, had roughly 300 specialized landing craft. The British Royal Navy, the world's largest at the war's start, had fewer than 100 landing craft purpose-built for amphibious operations. The United States, in just over 3 years, built more specialized landing craft than all other combatant nations combined had possessed in total naval vessels of any type at the war's start. And these were supplemental vessels, built alongside a massive fleet expansion that added hundreds of destroyers, dozens of aircraft carriers, thousands of cargo ships, and countless other vessels. This industrial performance exceeded not just Axis estimates but even Allied planners' initial projections. When the combined chiefs of staff began planning the Pacific Island hopping campaign and the eventual invasion of Europe in early 1942, estimates suggested that landing craft availability would be the limiting factor determining how many simultaneous operations could be conducted. By late 1943, landing craft were no longer the limiting factor. Instead, planners had to consider shipping capacity, trained troops availability, and logistical supply chains. The boats themselves were available in such numbers that operations could be planned based on strategic priorities rather than equipment availability. This shift from equipment-limited to strategy-limited operations marked a fundamental turning point in the war. Once the Allies could conduct amphibious operations, essentially at will, with enough landing craft available to assault multiple objectives simultaneously, Axis defensive strategy collapsed. Germany couldn't defend all of Europe's coastline. Japan couldn't garrison every Pacific island adequately. The sheer number of potential landing sites that could be struck simultaneously or in rapid succession made static defense impossible. The success of the Higgins boat design influenced post-war amphibious warfare doctrine worldwide. The basic concept, a simple, mass-producible landing craft with a bow, ramp, shallow draft, and standardized construction, became the template for amphibious vessels in navies around the globe. Modern landing craft, while incorporating improved materials and propulsion systems, still follow the fundamental design principles that Higgins established. Andrew Higgins himself didn't prosper in the post-war era. His company, so vital during wartime, found itself with massive production capacity and no orders. Government contracts that had sustained 20,000 workers ended abruptly. Higgins attempted to convert to civilian boat production, but couldn't compete effectively in the peacetime market. He struggled with debt, fought with creditors, and watched his industrial empire dissolve. He died in 1952, his company bankrupt, his wartime achievements fading into historical footnotes. The New Orleans facilities, where 23,000 landing craft had been built, were torn down or converted to other purposes. The workers who'd assembled, boats around the clock, dispersed to other industries or other cities. But the boats themselves, or rather, the principle they represented, had changed warfare permanently. The ability to land military forces on any coastline, sustained by rapid waves of supply delivery, made oceanic barriers less formidable and created a flexibility of operations that decisively favored nations with strong amphibious capabilities. For Yamamoto, surviving the war and returning to a devastated Japan, the lesson of the Higgins boats remained painfully clear decades later. Japan had fought with courage, with tactical skill, with sophisticated weapons and well-trained forces. But they'd fought an enemy whose fundamental approach to industrial production was so different from their own that Japanese planners had failed to even comprehend its implications. "We thought in terms of quality," Yamamoto wrote in his memoir. "The Americans thought in terms of quantity. We believed that one excellent ship was worth 10 adequate ships. They proved that 10 adequate ships, or 100, or 1,000, would always defeat one excellent ship through simple mathematics. And they had the industrial capacity to build not just 100 or 1,000, but tens of thousands." The landing craft that had seemed crude and unimpressive to Japanese naval observers embodied a principle that decided the war's outcome. Adequate equipment delivered in overwhelming quantity defeated superior equipment produced in limited numbers. The assembly line defeated the artisan's workshop. Mass production defeated craftsmanship. This wasn't a lesson about the superiority of American materials or engineering. The Higgins boat wasn't a better design in terms of elegance or sophistication. It was a lesson about manufacturing philosophy, industrial organization, and the willingness to prioritize quantity over quality when strategic circumstances demanded it. Japan had produced excellent ships, sophisticated aircraft, and high-quality weapons throughout the war. But excellence in design couldn't compensate for inadequacy in numbers. The best destroyer in the world couldn't be in two places at once. The most skilled pilot couldn't fly without fuel. The most courageously defended island fortress couldn't hold against wave after wave of attacks, delivered by an effectively infinite supply of landing craft. From his position on that Saipan Ridge in June of 1944, watching the 158th landing craft of the day grind onto the beach, Yamamoto had understood that the war was already lost. Not because of that day's battle, but because the enemy had demonstrated an industrial capacity that rendered Japanese defensive strategy obsolete. The mathematics were simple and brutal. If America could produce 23,000 landing craft in 3 years, while simultaneously building everything else a modern military required, then every defensive calculation, based on limiting American operational capacity through material attrition, was worthless. The defenders weren't buying time or wearing down American resources. They were simply dying slowly while American industry continued to expand. The welder from New Orleans, who'd argued with lumber suppliers in the Louisiana Bayou, had designed a boat that helped defeat two empires. Not through technological sophistication or revolutionary innovation, but through the simple principle that adequate equipment produced in overwhelming numbers would always defeat excellent equipment produced in limited quantities. It was a lesson Japan would absorb thoroughly in its post-war reconstruction, transforming into a nation that perfected mass production techniques and became an industrial powerhouse. But in 1944, watching those blunt-nosed boats swarm the beaches of Saipan, Yamamoto understood that this lesson was being taught at the cost of everything his nation had fought to defend. The landing craft kept coming, one wave after another, delivering an inexhaustible supply of marines, weapons, ammunition, and the crushing weight of American industrial capacity made manifest on a Pacific beach. And somewhere in Louisiana, workers who'd been building boats for oil prospectors just a few years earlier were already starting the next batch, maintaining a production pace that would continue until the war's end. 23,000 boats, built by a civilian company, using plywood and commercial engines. Designed by a businessman who'd never worn a uniform, produced by workers who'd learned shipbuilding in a matter of weeks rather than years, and more than sufficient to enable an amphibious campaign across an entire ocean, assaulting every defended island from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, delivering the force that would ultimately compel Japan's surrender. That was the reality that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. That was the truth that shattered defensive doctrine based on pre-war calculations. That was the power of American industrial capacity, concentrated in 23,000 ungainly, flat-bottomed, blunt-nosed boats that could run onto any beach and return for another load. Yamamoto survived the war, carried the memory of those endless landing craft through decades of peace, and eventually wrote his memoir to ensure that future generations understood not just what happened, but why. The story of the Higgins boat wasn't really about boats at all. It was about the collision between two incompatible visions of industrial warfare, and about the terrible clarity that comes from watching your nation's strategic assumptions dissolve under the weight of an enemy's inexhaustible material abundance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.